The first thing we need to remember when we think of chemicals is that none of us are toxicologists. Chemicals are very complex. They act in ways that go against what common sense would dictate. A tiny little bit of something can have tremendous impact. Think cyanide. We don't need a pound of that to wreak havoc. The impacts of chemicals are not immediate. Some of them can take years to happen. Think of cancers, for example. Chemicals interact with each other in ways that go beyond human understanding. A drop of something in a mixture can make that mixture 1,000 times more potent. One thing is for sure, we are not going to be experts by the end of this video. But we have enough time to talk about the food safety rules to remember when using chemicals. First off, there's a number of things management has already done ahead of time to minimize the risk to you and make your life easier. They selected the least toxic chemicals and ensured as few people as possible have to deal with each one. They defined safe storage practices for each chemical. They also translated technical information from MSDS and technical data sheets to a plain language you can read in simple documents like SOPs and work instructions. They provide you training on those work instructions, and then they check to make sure everyone understands what they should be doing. For most of us, the food safety rules we need to know about chemicals are very simple. There are 3 rules to remember. Label them, use them for their intended purpose, and report chemicals you don't need or use. First and foremost, we need to make sure chemicals are labeled all the time. If we don't know what's in that bucket, it's very unlikely we will deal with it appropriately. You might say, well, we could just dump it down the drain. Not my problem anymore, right? Did I really hear that? We are focusing on food safety now, but you're never allowed to forget about health and safety. Good information is key, whether we are concerned about food safety, environmental health and safety, or all of them at once, as we should. If you transfer chemicals to a bucket and never leave it unattended, it doesn't really need to be labeled. The problem arises if you go on break, or if you're called somewhere else for an emergency and leave the bucket unattended. Then it needs to be labeled. So why not play it safe and label everything all the time? The second thing to know is how to use each chemical. You should be trained on each task using a standard operating procedure, a work instruction, a one-point lesson, or some other form of training document. That is true for laboratory chemicals, for sanitation chemicals, for pesticides, for chemicals used in production. It's not always the case for maintenance chemicals. Maintenance work is not standardized like work is in other departments. We can't plan when a mechanic will need anti-seize compound or when and where he will need to plug a hole with silicone. However, the intended use for each product is quite clear. Diesel fuel is not meant to wash hands. I know it's a great solvent and it could be handy when you get a bit of tar on your hands while fixing the roof, but it's not meant for that. Just like silicone, it's not a structural element. It's not meant to hold metal plates together. I know it works, but it's not meant for that. You get the idea, don't you? When we talk about food grade and approved for food contact surfaces, we refer to least toxic or non-toxic formulations. There are restrictions, however, on what is food grade. For example, it doesn't take long for metal particles to get mixed in bearing grease. So when you see food grade grease oozing out of a bearing, is it still food grade? Finally, you should only have access to those chemicals you normally use in your work. Each one should be stored in a dedicated area with access limited according to risk. Concentrated and other hazardous chemicals should be locked. That's a given. For mild chemicals, I don't think all doors need to be locked and the hounds set free. A closed cabinet should suffice. You shouldn't keep a stash of this and a bottle of that just in case. There's no reason maintenance should keep a tube of grease, a bottle of adhesive, and a can of paint in the packer cabinet. Those should be sent back to the shop. If, for whatever reason, specialized trades need to store chemicals in production or packaging areas, they should have their own cabinets. Chemicals used day in, day out can be stored in production, especially if everybody who works in the area has been trained on their use. So there are 3 things to remember. Always label chemicals. You're responsible for ensuring chemicals used and stored in your area are labeled. Make sure you know how to use each chemical. Use chemicals for their intended uses only. Ask that the chemicals you don't use be removed from your storage area. There should be a list of approved chemicals in your cabinets. If you can remember those 3 things, then you'll pass the test. Oh, they told you about the test, didn't they?